Welcome back. So at this point in time, you should have read Politics, a Very Short Introduction, Chapter 1. So what we're going to do now is talk about some of the key points brought up in that text and expand on it a little bit. So the big takeaway from the first chapter of this book is a discussion of what political theory is and what some of the key assumptions made by political philosophy are. So we're going to focus our discussion on these core issues. So political theory is a normative discipline in which we analyze the way that political structures ought to be structured, right? And here, when we say political, we mean things not just like governments, but also social structures, right? So anarchic, no governmental communes, right, would still have some sort of political structure to them. So that's one important thing to pay attention to, right? We're really talking about the system of rules or governance that is in place when we interact with one another. There are three key ideas, three key assumptions that this discipline makes. The first is that politics has an impact on the everyday life of the people who live under it. The second, that we have some ability to determine what shape our government will take, or what shape our political system will take. And finally, that it is possible for us to have some form of knowledge about how governments ought to be shaped and that sort of thing. So we're going to take a moment to take a look at each of these in turn before we move on to later chapters where we'll see these playing out more thoroughly. So, the first assumption is that politics has an impact on everyday life, right? The way that our governmental structure is shaped, the way that our society is shaped, impacts the way we live. Now, I think this is not terribly surprising, right? A bad government or a bad political system is lawless, violent, might have tyranny and oppression, right? The author gives the example of Hitler's Germany, right? World War II and the Holocaust. Clearly, how that government was shaped influenced the lives of the people who lived under it. On the other hand, right, a good government or a good social system can help incline us towards stable, prosperous, happy lives with lots of opportunities. It can help defend freedoms. It can help pursue our success. So how we structure our governmental system does seem very important for the quality of life we may have just as we go through our everyday lives. The second assumption of political theory is that government is flexible, or social structure is flexible. That is, we have some ability to determine and shape the way that our governments and social structures function. Now, there have been a couple of views that have suggested this is not the case. So, historical fatalism, one way we might take a look at it is, so we've got people who think that history flows in cycles, good, then bad, and nothing can be done about that. We have Marx, sort of Marxist approach where history progresses in a very linear way. And this would mean, if this were true, that there's nothing we can really do to change our society. So there's not as much of a benefit to spending all this time trying to figure out how it ought to be because we can't do anything about it. Luckily, this view has been undone by historical patterns. That is, if you look at the past, you can see that people have systematically changed their governments, their social structures. Right? You can see revolution. You can see appeasement of tyrants, right? We can, by the choices we make, influence the way our government is shaped. And in fact, the governments of all the world. A more modern fatalism, a more modern sort of pessimism about our ability to influence the way that government is shaped, that social structures are shaped, comes in the form of globalist fatalism. This idea here is that states, governments, what have you, are forced into certain patterns because of the global climate, particularly the economic climate. That is, if you really want to change things too much, you'll end up on the downside of global political pressures. And that makes it really impracticable and potentially impossible for a government to adopt certain types of structures. Again, however, we're seeing that this idea is fading. We see global backlash against certain structures. We see movements forming across the world to refine and revise the way their government works. And even if this were true, there would still presumably be some amount of flexibility within which you could alter your government, right? This isn't going to be, strictly speaking, you have to do exactly this. It would outline a permissible range. So worst case scenario, there's a permissible range, right? There's this minimal set of options from which we can select our view. But if we look at the way that global contemporary politics are flowing, so we look at things like the Arab Spring, what we see is then actually, even that assumption that we have to stick to some particular set of allowed political structures isn't really true. And that increasingly, there is an ability to select widely variable ways of governing for our own purposes. So it does appear that government is something we can shape. Social structures are something we can shape. So let's take a look at the last assumption here. Our final assumption here is about the role and possibility of political knowledge. So we've got sort of a dual question, which is, does political theory matter? And is it able to generate truth? So one way of looking at this question is to say, well, does political theory have consequences for the way the world works, right? That would be one indication that it has some sort of grip on reality. And while some people have been suspicious of this in the past, it looks like this is true, right? The United States is heavily influenced by liberal ideology. By here, I mean classical liberalism, something we'll talk about more as the class moves forward. If you look at the foundational documents of the United States, they're heavily influenced by philosophical work, particularly the work of John Locke. Likewise, we look at Maoist China and communism, right? We look at the Soviet Union and communism, right? These governments are heavily influenced by the philosophical ideas they adopted about how a government, how a society ought to be shaped. So it is clear to at least some extent that political theory and political philosophy can be efficacious when it comes to determining the structure of political world, right? Now, the possibility, though, of having an actual political knowledge, right, as opposed to just political beliefs, right? So, you know, the United States and its classical liberalist roots, right? We're saying, well, classical liberalism is the belief that these people had when they made the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and so of course we see that influence there. But we also want something more than that, presumably, right? Think back to our chapters on epistemology, right? We want something like knowledge. We want to know that we are right. Not just saying that these people believed in this particular view, but that they were right to do so. Is it possible, then, for us to generate political truths? It's not entirely clear, to me, which way to go here. On the one hand, right, the possibility of political knowledge as a normative discipline encounters many of the same challenges that we encounter with the possibility of ethical knowledge, right? And we've talked about this in our last couple of weeks. Is it possible for us to know what is morally good and what is morally bad, or do we just sort of guess around? Are those terms even meaningful outside of our guesses, right? Outside of our opinions? Now, at the very least, systematic reflection can be used to help us achieve our goals once we know what they are. And this is something that the text points out, right? So I know that I want to maximize wealth amongst my populace. Well, now I need to reflect upon that and figure out what systems will do that. And it's probable that some amount of reflection will help us bring our values into coherence with one another, right? You want to maximize wealth, but you also want to maximize equality. Well, so now you have to start nudging those ideas closer together and refining what it is that you're actually shooting for. One major question to keep in mind as we move through this text, though, is whether or not we're ever going to be able to find a fact of the matter about how society ought to be structured. Another thing to point out is that some aspects of political philosophy appear to be talking about sort of universal considerations, whereas others are heavily impacted by their material conditions and social settings, right? So throughout history, you see a lot of discussion about things like the nature of political authority, which will be the topic of our next chapter. You see a lot of discussion about the role of government in education. But there are other topics, things like how governments should interact with the threat of globalism, or the opportunities of globalism, how governments should cooperate with one another across the world. And these are heavily influenced by contemporary issues, right? Things about the way the world is right now. So it's possible then that if there is a kind of knowledge here, that some elements may count as sort of a universal knowledge, some may be situated. So this is another thing to keep attention to, another thing to pay attention to, is whether or not the kinds of knowledge we're generating here, when we reflect on political principles, is going to be universal or highly situated. If it's highly situated, then at best we have something like a relativistic knowledge, right? Well, given our current society, the way the world is shaped, the ideas we have about how things work, then this is true. But it wouldn't be true elsewhere and for others. And it may not even be true elsewhere in the world right now. If there are universals, however, then we're going to be making much bolder claims. Something akin to the moral realist claim, right? That this is how things ought to be done everywhere and always. The third chapter, which we'll get to next week, is going to talk about democracy. And this is a good example, right? Is democracy something that is only appropriate for certain societies under certain constraints? Or is democracy supposedly the ideal governmental system for the world as a whole? This is a challenge that Democrats have been struggling with for years now, and for centuries now, actually. And it's certainly one worth considering. So that's our final challenge, right? Right. So in review, right, we've got these three challenges or these three assumptions, which are themselves challenging, when we engage in political theory. The first being that politics influences our life. This one is probably pretty clear. The second being that governments can be shaped and structured according to the beliefs of the populace and the sorts of results we generate in political theory. That is probably true as well. The final assumption is the one I think is the most problematic, which is, how can we tell the difference between mere political beliefs and political knowledge? And in fact, is political knowledge possible? So these are questions and assumptions to keep in your mind as you move forward in this text, to understand where political philosophy is coming from and what sorts of assumptions are being made as we move forward and as we argue. With that, I will see you for next chapter, and have a good one.